So I'll get us started. For the specific topics, I will be talking about the Clowder data previewers. That's the original term. We use previews and previewers, but I hope you will see that it's a more generic functionality that could be used to do all sort of data visualization. So if you upload a file to Clowder and you don't have any previewers, any extractors running, or the files doesn't have a specific type, you will not see anything on the page in terms of actually visualizing the information within the file. So you can still interact with the file, download it, and all of that, but nothing shows up. So most of the time when you upload some, your typical MIME type, so images, text, videos, and 3D objects, you will get some kind of preview on the page. And so for the core kind of native bytes, that's pretty straightforward. We support all the basic types. There isn't really much going on, but I will show you that even in these cases, there's still ways of customizing how this works. For the most part, when we started, we said, well, we want to show previews of data. For example, if you have a large video, right, we want to show a subsample, a smaller version of that video so you can more easily stream it to the client. So the original file itself could be very, very large. What we show in the preview is much smaller. So for example, in the case of the text, we only show X number of rows and not all the rows in the text files and so on. There's also some interactivity with these previewers. So in the case of the OBJ, if you upload an OBJ file to Clowder, you will see this 3D representation. You can actually click and drag, and you can look at the object in 3D. And again, these are all kind of native to the browser, but we did have to add some code that's extensible to make this happen. So we use this in a variety of ways. So for example, these are 3 examples of images that are shown in Clowder, but in this case, this is not the raw data. So in the first case, this is automatic glomerulus extraction. See, these are kidney slides. We identify cells. And what we show in the preview is not the original file. We show the slide plus the colored cell that was identified using image vision. The same with the second one. This is a TERF canopy coverage estimation. So these are plans. You can't see the ground behind it because some extractor ran, created this new version of the image that highlights the plant matter. And we show that as a preview on that file. The original file is a TIFF file RGB that has a lot more information. But in this preview, only certain information is shown that requires some computation. Same thing with the third one. So you got this plant in a lab, and they take pictures, again, as part of the TerraRec project, of these plants, and they use this plant CV library to identify the plant matter. And so again, the preview itself here is just an image, pretty straightforward, but the information encoded in it, it's not the original information of the raw file that you would get if you download the file. Many times in this case, there is the main role is kind of fulfilled by the extractor, the metadata extractor. So if you're not familiar with it, when you upload the file to Clowder or some other event happens in Clowder, there might be some code behind the scene that automatically runs on that information, or you can manually submit it to those. So those are what we call extractors. So for this, we got 3 different extractors that result in these 3 different images. There's also some basic interactivity that you can have in previewers. So for example, you can go to an image. In this case, this is an image of a page in a PDF. And you can kind of highlight a section of it, and you can leave a tag and a comment that become tag and comments on that file and on that section inside that image. So again, these are just examples to show you what we can do in Clowder right now and what potentially similar things you can do depending on your use case. So you can have interactivity with it. So what happens behind the scenes is that you have the original file, and like I've mentioned, you have these previewers. So this is the code that I'm going to tell you a little bit about in a little bit, how you can develop your own and add them to Clowder. But also in between, there's a kind of a third entity, which is the preview itself. So what that means is that in some cases, and I'll show you some examples, in some cases, we take the raw bytes of the file and this piece of JavaScript that shows that those raw bytes to the user. In other cases, what we have is we have a representation of that information that then gets used by the previewer to actually show you some meaningful information, which again, that preview is something that was derived from the original file. So for files, it's very important to keep this in mind. What you see is the previewer, but the information you're being shown is either from a file or a preview object that has been attached to a file. Almost always that preview object is created by one of these extractors. So for example, this is something that Sandeep worked on the group scope project, NSF project. And so in this case, the raw file is some video. And what you see is both the video that you can play, but also visualization under that shows you when different subjects enter the frame and leave the frame, and even where in the video those subjects are. So this is an example of the raw file is video, but an extractor has had to extract all this information. All that information goes into these preview objects, and then the previewer itself that you see in the page actually shows you that information, right? So this is a great example of that kind of thing. It also shows that you can be creative in the kind of thing you do on the page, like in this case, right? That kind of timeline at the bottom is somewhat unique to this use case, although it could be generalized for other time coding of videos. Also, I haven't mentioned, but at the top you can see there can be multiple previews, and I should have made that clear. So a file can have multiple previews and previewers, and you can, right now you have to tab between them. This is another example. It's technically not a previewer in the code. It's kind of a standalone functionality, but it could be a preview in the code. And basically, this is again a video. We identified shots using computer vision. This was done for an Exceed project, the LSDA BAT project. And what we did was, we have the video, and then here we're actually creating sections of that video, of that file. And then below we show the sections underneath so that you also have the time coding and you can jump between the sections, jump to that time coded. This is actually a place where this functionality is looking at something within Clowder that is called a section within a file. So it's slightly different. It's looking at more different information than what we have discussed so far. But this is also important because it's important to understand that, and I'll show you an example, when you write these previewers, you basically can have basic information, the bytes of the file, but you also have access to the full Clowder API, so you can get a lot of this other information about the file inside the previewer itself. So far I've been talking about files. We do have dataset previews and previewers. Actually, previews, and I'll qualify what that means in a second. So Clowder organizes files in containers called datasets. Datasets have the files as well as metadata and a lot of other information about that data. In here, what we show is two different previews or previewers for datasets. So when you go to a dataset, on the left, if there is zip files and TIFF files that have geospatial information within them, so these are individual files in the datasets. If any of them have that kind of information, then the visualization tab for the dataset will show you this geospatial view of all the layers together. So what you're seeing here is what you see on the right, these layers, 2, 4, 6, 8 layers, are individual files within the datasets. There could be other files like PDF, images, and so on, but we basically show just the ones that can be shown on the map. They're georeferenced, both raster as well as shape files. On the right, it's another one that usually shows up for all datasets. I believe it's enabled by default. That just goes through, and for every single file within the dataset, it takes the MIME type, and then it counts how many files are present in the dataset with that MIME type, and it shows you this kind of simple visualization to give you a sense of what is in that dataset. So I'll tell you a little bit more about these in a second, but In the case of data sets, there is actually no preview object. We do everything against the data set, but as I've mentioned, we're actually looking at a lot of information within the data set. So we usually call a lot of API endpoints to figure out what we're going to show. So for example, what files are in this data set, what metadata is on these files, and so on. And then the previewers themselves is the code that shows that information. So here is a little bit more, one slide just tells you about a little bit more about this relationship between extractors, previews, and previewers. So now we're looking at a file. This is a TIFF file, GeoTIFF. When a GeoTIFF is uploaded, if you have the proper, extractors running, behind the scenes, what happens is you will see a map, and on that map that you can zoom in and out, and then the map, you will see this geospatial layer, and you can change the opacity on that layer. So that happens automatically. The user sees that, and that's it. But how does that really happen behind the scenes? So the first thing to keep in mind is that previewer, what it's doing, it's looking at the metadata on the file. And it's saying, do I have WMS layers defined on that file? I don't know if you can read that well. But these are OGC standards, and it's basically saying, yes, I have a layer, and you can have access to it using the WMS protocol. And so then the previewer just renders the map and puts that layer on the map, and that's it. It ignores a lot of the other ones. But basically, if you were to add this information manually or with an extractor of your development, that map would show up. The way we create and we add this information behind the scenes is using an extractor, right? So we have an extractor that we run. This is available. It's open source. You can run it. And that extractor creates that metadata. That extractor also does something else, which is it talks to this GeoServer service that we run for the instances that need to support this kind of functionality. And that GeoServer is actually what serves the actual layer and that we see rendered on the page. This is also important because it shows you that many times when you're trying to visualize information about the file or data set, you might be wanting to use some special purpose services, but this is an example of that. So while the user just sees that map, they can zoom in and out. Behind the scenes, that's everything that is going on. And you can replace extractors and services with something else if you want. And you could be talking to other endpoints. In this case, we're just looking at the metadata on the file. So how do you create a preview or a previewer? Here's an example. This is a very basic example of an audio file. So you have an audio file, you upload it, and then you can play that audio file. Well, so behind the scene, what you have to create is create one of these previewers. And there's two major kind of required files. One is this manifest, this package.json. I hope you can see my mouse. And so in here, we have some basic information about it. The name, what is the JavaScript file that runs when this previewer shows up. That's the other file that we have here in the directory. Preview equal true means that this is going to be running on a preview. So this can be file, data set, basically tells Clowder when to trigger, or when to try to see if they can run. So it triggers it, but then you can still say, well, I have something to show, or maybe not. In this case, we're looking at these previews objects on the file to be able to show this. When do we do that? In the case of files, because files have content types, we do it for these MIME types, and so we just list them up. So that means that every time there's a file and Clowder recognizes it at one of these MIME types, then it runs the code if there's a preview object. What the code does, it's pretty straightforward. It's JavaScript code. Most of this is kind of boilerplate. We're just using jQuery, and we're getting from this configuration object within that Clowder populates, we're getting the ID in the page of the element we want to add our visualizer to, visualization to, or previewer to, and then we're getting a URL from which we're going to get the raw bytes. And then what we do is a simple jQuery append, and we add the tag audio, which nowadays is basically supported by browsers. And so you get this nice little visualization that is dependent on the browser implementation. And then you can play it. And when it does, it gets the bytes from the URL. So this is a very simple use case, right? This is a very simple preview. Here's a little bit more complex one. So this is the one for the data set. So if you go to data set, you go to the visualization tab, you see this visualization. This is a D3 visualization, D3.js visualization. And so what we see in here is that we have the package, we have a main.js JavaScript file, and some other resources, in this case, CSS. If we look at what's in the package.js, we have a name, a main, as we have seen it. Content type has nothing, because in the case of data sets, we currently don't really type them. We have been discussing ways to type data sets in meaningful ways, so eventually this could be used by data sets previewers as well. And as you can see, we say that we want to trigger this on a data set. So every time we have a data set, we will be triggering this. Ignore this one. This was used for collections, but this was just playing around with it. It's currently not being used at all. So what does the JavaScript file look like? This is one of those cases where we know what data sets we're in, but we want to look at the files because we want to look at their MIME types. So what we do is we get some metadata about all the files within this data set. And this is a call to the Clowder API. You could be doing this as a client outside of Clowder. We're just doing it within the JavaScript within Clowder. And so then the next thing that we do is we load D3.js. We load it from our Clowder version of D3.js, but you actually don't need to do that. It could be external, to Clowder. It's just the JavaScript that you need to run. So we load that, and then this is some D3 code that gives us this visualization. Not all of it is just the top of it, but this is D3 specific code. So you can see how you can do all sort of things using existing JavaScript libraries and any kind of information within the Clowder API. Okay, so there's more examples in the code in Clowder itself. Most of this is the ones I've mentioned so far. Most of the previewers are embedded with the core of Clowder. They actually don't need to be. And we've been discussing ways in which we want to kind of create a tool catalog or a catalog of these previewers that is outside of the main code base, because it doesn't have to be actually inside the code base to be able to run within Clowder. So what that means is that you can actually, if you have a live instance of Clowder, you can deploy new previewers that you have developed at runtime. You actually don't even need to restart Clowder. And the way you do it is, if you're familiar with what Clowder looks when it's actually deployed somewhere, there will be, for the most part, you will always have some custom directory at the root of the Clowder, instance, and it's, on the file system. And in that custom directory, you just have to add public JavaScript previewers, and in there you can just add your previewers. So these are not the ones that are built in, these are the ones that you have created. So for example, here I was playing around with an audio visualization one, and so you just put it there, you refresh the page, and if it matches all the requirements out of the package.json, then it will show up within the UI. So that's it. That's what previewers in Clouders can do and how we use them. It's not all of the ones that we have, but here I've highlighted the ways we currently use them. So we use them to show the native kind of bytes of the files, show smaller versions for larger files. We use them to show the right information created by an extractor or available through the metadata. We can let user interact with it to a certain extent. But we can do a lot more, because basically any kind of JavaScript that you can embed in there, you can use to do whatever you want. And so there's a lot of possibilities of things that you can do with it. So we're really looking for ideas and ways to kind of show the power of this framework. Because right now, while we have a lot of extractors, we definitely don't have a lot of previewers. And we think that one of the reasons is that we just don't advertise this and we don't show, right, how easy it is to actually create and deploy them. So please think about, what things can you build for your data that makes sense, or maybe you have existing visualization that you want to try to make available within Cloud. And that's it. So thank you. And any questions before we move to Mike? Yes, Shannon.
Documentation on the ease with which you can just put that previewer into the subdirectory and it just works. Is that documented anywhere?
No, that's not documented. So now we have slides, and next it will be in the Swagger documentation. Thank you. Any other questions?
So, one question about previews can work on previews as well as the raw data. Right? I think I understand that this might have come through like different use cases, wanting to have certain things. Is there a need for standardizing, or saying that a preview always works in preview, or a preview always works in raw data, or is it?
Yes, that's a great question. So Sandeep asks, why can a previewer work on a preview representation and the raw bytes? Is there a need for both, and when would you use one or the other? There's a couple of things that we discovered. One is for the main, there are many reasons. One is obviously if you need to show things that are not in the raw bytes, then you will need some container to host these other bytes, right? And so the preview object gives you that. So that's one reason. The other reason is that if you have an instance of Clowder that will show you the metadata publicly for the file, but you need to log in to actually download the file, then you will not be able to get the raw bytes unless you're logged in. And so because of that, you will have to rely on previews. So more generically, if you have these instances, really you kind of want to get them from the preview, because there's kind of an implication that in that case it will be shown, even though you might not get the raw bytes themselves. So those are the two reasons that I can think of why have both. Thank you.
To go back to Shannon's question, in the wiki page there is a link to customization of Clowder, where that exactly is described, both the style sheets as well as the additional previews.
Yeah, because that's generic functionality. So you can override a lot of the front-end stuff by using the custom. So it's not just for previewers. It's also for everything else, including, for example, if you want to change the bootstrap style sheet of the entire site, you can put it in there and then Clowder will pick it up. Thank you, Robert.